G'day, Dr. Carl, Shirtloads of Science, University of Sydney. And today I'm very lucky to be talking about being able to stay underwater in freezing cold conditions forever. Something like that. Not quite. Now, let me introduce you to the microphone, Dr. Hunter Bennett. You're a senior lecturer in what field?
Exercise science.
Exercise science at the University of South Australia.
Yeah, that's correct.
And a bit of background here. You've written articles and papers, scientific papers, about ice baths. And blow me down, often you'll go down the beach and there'll be a barrel, and sometimes it's got cold water and sometimes it's got actual ice cubes, and people are paying money to jump in on the grounds that will cure sunstroke, syphilis, varicose veins, bad handwriting, help them levitate and win a Nobel Prize as well. Okay, I'm exaggerating here. So how do you want to just start this off, Dr. Hunter?
Yeah, look, I actually don't think that's too much of an exaggeration, you know? You
From what we read.
Yeah, exactly. You see all these things on social media about, the benefits of ice bath, having benefits on cognitive health, mental health, physical health, brain health, heart health, etc. They're essentially a panacea to cure everything. And yeah, the research we did here with a large group of us, so I obviously can't take credit for all of it, but we sort of did a pretty broad literature search just to examine all the research looking at sort of ice baths in those general health contexts. And there really just wasn't much out there at all. Like a little bit of evidence to suggest that maybe regular ice baths will make you sick less often. Maybe they have a positive effect on inflammation, but beyond that, there's sort of not much research to support their use. There's certainly use in athletic contexts, but not so much in that general health space.
Well, you sent me a paper to read, which was called Baseless Claims and Pseudoscience in Health and Wellness, a call to action for the sports, exercise and nutrition science community. Thank you very much for sending that to me, as well as your own papers. And I was astonished to find out how much money is spent on wellness and health. And so out of a world GDP of $100 trillion, and Australia generates one and a half, the wellness industry and health takes $4 trillion. And there are so many of these claims. Can you run me through some of these claims that you've come across?
Yeah, certainly. So I think the health and fitness industry is interesting because it really is sort of rife with misinformation and disinformation. And I don't know exactly why that's the case, but I think part of it is just because lots of different things can work. So people fall into these camps of potentially, really buying into some sort of method or some sort of process that worked for them, and then they sort of think that that's the be all and end all. But you see it really, really often with sort of types of exercise. So you'll hear people talk about high intensity interval training being the best method to lose weight and improve heart health and all that sort of stuff. You really see it with diet. There's sort of all these different dietary patterns that are becoming really prevalent in the space at the moment. Things like the ketogenic diet, things like the carnivore diet, even things like the paleo diet, which are quite dogmatic, and you sort of see those ways of eating being sort of spoken about a lot. And then there's also just sort of the supplement industry more broadly, which is worth, like you said, billions upon billions of dollars, potentially even trillions of dollars, just looking at supplements alone. And often the evidence to support them is pretty scarce.
Let's pick, say, exercise. So suppose I'm an AFL football player, and in a couple of hours I'll run 14 kilometres. Uh, and I'm also jumping and doing all sorts of stuff. I'm pretty well going flat out for a couple of hours. And there are extreme sports like that. Are there any benefits in ice bars for those people?
Yeah, certainly. So if we're looking at sort of athletic populations, I think the football is a really good example. So those team sport sort of athletes, like you said, they cover really large distances throughout a game. So it could be anywhere from 10 to 20 kilometers. But that a lot of that is really high intensity effort. So they're doing short sprints, they're doing changes of direction, they're doing things that generally cause quite a bit of muscle damage. And then because of that muscle damage, we see sort of increases in inflammation, and that can sort of impair our performance over the next couple of days. It's essentially why we wake up, unable to walk the day after a hard footy game. So if you do sort of participate in some ice baths after a game, you will reduce some of that inflammation. You'll prevent or reduce some of the markers of muscle damage that we see after a game, and as a result, you tend to see like a faster return to peak performance or baseline performance. So it essentially accelerates recovery. Probably the one thing that people maybe aren't super aware of is that that is really useful when we're looking at sort of team sport athletes who are playing during a season. So, they might have multiple games that are separated by a week. And we really need to get them back to peak performance so that they can train to a high quality and then perform again the next weekend. But there's also some evidence to suggest that if you were to do an ice bath too frequently after, say, weight training, you would actually blunt some of the improvements that you would hope to see in muscle growth and muscle strength and muscle power. So it has these really like useful context after sort of intense matches, but if we use them too regularly, they can have some negatives.
So a little can be good, but too much can be bad.
Yeah, it's maybe less a matter of how much and more a matter of when. So, say, for example, using that AFL player during, say, the preseason when they don't have matches, we don't really care about how well they're performing. We're more interested in about creating adaptations, so getting them stronger, getting them more muscular, getting them fitter. That inflammatory process that happens after training actually stimulates some of those positive adaptations that we want. So if we get them into an ice bath after every training session, we blunt that inflammation and we prevent some of those adaptations from occurring. So during the
So they
pre,
don't get as strong.
yeah,
And in this case, I'm just guessing with a football player, you're looking at a mixture of muscle fitness, muscle strength, and but also aerobic fitness, which is your main thing that you're aiming for in, say, a football player.
it's largely both, and it's going to be a little bit dependent on the person that you're working with, or the sort of, I guess, the qualities of the athlete, the physical qualities, not how good they are. But say for example, we've got a new draftee who's coming through. They're 18, 19 years old, and they might have a very, very good, well developed aerobic base. They're really fit. They can run 20 kilometers without breaking a sweat. But they weigh 65 kilos. Then the priority for them is getting them bigger and stronger. Whereas if
Ah,
we've got a veteran who's maybe been in the system for 10 years, they've got a really well developed sort of muscular system, we might spend a bit more time focusing on sort of aerobic adaptations for them. So it's a little bit individual, depending on how long the athlete's been in the system and what they need to improve.
yeah. Like an example that I came across is roughly similar to what you're talking about is women who are going through a muscle training program at a gym, and they were broken into two groups who did the training under supervision. And at the end of the time, one group who just did the muscle training, they end up losing 2 kilograms of fat but putting on 1 kilogram of muscle, so they were just sort of feeling healthier and stronger. The other group did the same exercise, but they took antioxidants after each training session, and they didn't lose the fat and they didn't put on a muscle. So there are grounds for sometimes inflammation is good after exercise. Well, but then what about somebody doing moderate exercise, like they go to the gym, they're not pushing themselves to the maximum all the way through, and they're doing it not so often. Would ice baths be good for them or bad for them?
So, to be honest, it's so just going back to what we said before, like about those sort of blunted adaptations. So getting like less progress, I guess. That generally seems to be a little bit more pronounced in those sort of muscular fitness qualities, and less so in some of those like aerobic endurance qualities. So if this person was just looking to exercise for general health and fitness, and they were doing a lot more aerobic exercise, it probably wouldn't have any negative effects. I don't know that it would have any positive effects either, unless they personally felt like it made them feel really good. That would be maybe one use case for it.
Yeah.
Whereas if they were someone who was starting exercise and their goal was to build muscle, and build strength, and that was kind of something that they were personally invested in, I would probably suggest that they don't do ice baths, just because then it could, theoretically, impair some of those adaptations that they want to make.
Ah, so I'm getting a hint from you. There's a difference between muscle fitness, muscle strength, and then aerobics. What about somebody who's just purely aerobics, like a marathon runner, or do you just use sports runner for fun?
Yeah, no, like either one of those, they're probably going to see less negative effects from regular ice baths. You do still get some sort of muscular adaptations as a result of aerobic exercise. So maybe the marathon runner might have really easy sessions that don't place much stress on their legs. Their sort of muscles aren't that fatigued from it, and it is maybe more of like a cardiovascular strain, so it works their hearts and lungs and cardiovascular system a little bit more. After that sort of session, they're probably fine to ice bath and they're not going to see any negative effects. If they're doing something like an interval session where maybe we get a little bit more stimulus through the muscle, they're running a bit faster, they're accumulating a little bit more lactate, those sorts of things, then maybe that's the type of session that we might want to do. Might not want to do an ice bath after, because maybe that will impair some of those sort of muscular responses.
Look, just off the top of your head, would you know how much people charge for these ice baths? You know, you see them down the beach or something. Is it like $1 or $100 or something a go?
Do you know, I'm actually not sure about the single, for a single use. I know there's sort of contrast therapy places where they might have like a hot bath and an ice bath that you can pay memberships for, and they can be, $50 a week would not be uncommon here in SA. And then you also see a lot of people actually buying ice baths for home, which are, can be upwards of thousands of dollars at some times.
What about the habit in certain northern parts of the world in Scandinavia, where they do the sauna, then jump into a convenient lake, and then back into the sauna again? What about that?
Yeah, so there's actually not a lot of research looking at that in like or at least that I'm not aware of, looking at it in like a sort of really randomized control environment. What we do see is the people who participate in that sort of those activities at like a population level in those countries, they do generally have slightly better health than people who don't sort of partake in those activities, or people from different populations. The really hard thing to tease out when we're looking at those sorts of like large population sort of research is that there's the potential for those people who participate in those sort of activities just simply to be a little bit more health conscious anyway. So it's hard to identify whether those improvements in health are because of the sauna and the jumping in the lake and the sauna and the jumping in the lake, or just because the people who do that sort of thing also eat better and exercise more and are more health conscious in general. So it does seem to be a little bit of an indication that people who do that are a little bit healthier, but we don't really know if that's what's causing it.
So, is this what they call in statistics a confounding effect?
Yeah, yeah. So it could be confounded by their other behaviors, essentially. Yeah, and in that sort of study design where we're looking at just a single point in or a single moment in time, we're looking at the association between two different variables. In this case, health and a certain behavior. We know that they are related in some way, but we just don't know whether one is causing the other.
Okay, now let me just dive off into something slightly different here, which is somebody who is famous for promoting ice baths. And this is the Dutch person called Wim Hof. And he pushes something called the Wim Hof method. And his records and stunts are actually quite amazing. Like, I believe I've seen him running partially clad through the snow. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, yeah. So, I'll be the first to say I'm not an expert in the Wim Hof method, but I'm certainly aware of who Wim Hof is. And yeah, absolutely, you'll see him, doing all these amazing things, sitting in ice baths for hours on end, like you said, running through the snow in nothing but a pair of jocks. Like it's unique and fairly impressive, to be honest.
Now, I'm looking here on Wikipedia, and the first fastest half marathon run while barefoot on ice or snow, that's a fairly obscure record, is 2 hours and 16 minutes. Back in 2007, he did that. He also set back in 2000 the record for the farthest swim under ice, 57 meters. Oh my God. On one occasion, he passed out, and a rescue diver had to pull him to the surface. The record's now been broken. And he's also said back in 2010, that record's been broken, but he did it first, for direct full body contact with ice, 44 minutes. But you and I, we would go into hypothermia. Can you talk a bit about hypothermia and its dangers, and how come he doesn't seem to suffer from it?
Yeah. So something that we do see, and it's probably less common in things like ice baths, but does seem to happen a little bit more frequently with like cold water immersion, outside essentially, is cold shock. So if someone's enters cold water, and generally it involves sort of their whole body, so their head, neck, etc., enter cold water, they can sort of experience what's known as cold shock, where we might see an increase in heart rate, an increase in blood pressure, sort of hyperventilation, gasping, and in some cases even like a cardiac arrhythmia, which can obviously be quite bad if you're are submerged in water when it does happen. And we do see sort of signs of that cold shock occurring when we just enter an ice bath. You know, if you've never done an ice bath before and you jump in for the first time, it's not a uncommon experience to gasp, hyperventilate, and sort of have those fast, rapid breaths. What we tend to see though is there's some inkling in the research that that will reduce over time. So the more you expose yourself to cold bath, you'll probably see a reduction in, the cold shock response. But I think as well, there's just a massive genetic component to it. Like I think, I don't know if I would ever be able to swim 57 meters under the ice, no matter how much you trained me. So I think there's also a genetic component going on there. One, like he's probably exposed himself to cold enough to have a really blunted cold shock response, or maybe a non-existent cold shock response now. But also, I think there would be a genetic component for sure.
Because he does teach the Wim Hof method, which involves meditation and a whole bunch of disciplines. And on one hand, they're perfectly fine, so long as it doesn't cost you too much or send you down a useless pathway and send you broke. According to the Wikipedia homepage, some 3 dozen people have died from doing this ice bath thing and then going into a cardiac arrhythmia, which is fancy talk for the rhythm of your heart is disrupted, and then they died. But I'm imagining that this is a very rare event. So, Dr. Hunter, what sort of tips would you give for people who want to go ahead and do this and how to do it safely?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a few things that you can do that I think would make it safer, and would also align with sort of best practice in the research. So firstly, most people are shocked to hear that the water doesn't actually have to be that cold. So 10 to 15 degrees seems to be about the sweet spot in terms of like maximizing recovery. So it's cold. If you jump in a pool that's 12 degrees, you certainly know about it, but it's not ice cold. Um, the duration doesn't have to be that long. So a 10 to 15 minutes seems to be the sweet spot. So an easy way to remember duration and temperatures 10 to 15 degrees at 10 to 15 minutes. Um, you can also break that up into smaller chunks. So you're not submerged for 10 minutes at a time or 15 minutes at a time. So maybe you could do 3 minutes, hop out for a couple minutes, hop back in for 3 minutes, hop out for a couple of minutes, and just sort of repeat that to accumulate your 10 to 15 minutes. Um, you don't necessarily need to submerge your head. So we generally see cold shock occur when people are submerging their neck and head and essentially their whole body's underwater. Certainly no reason to do that if you don't want to. And then lastly, you don't have to use them all the time. In fact, I'd probably advise against it. We've already spoken about it before, how if we use it too often after training, it can sort of impair some of those increases in strength and muscle fitness. So yeah, you might just want to use that after really intense sessions as opposed to after every training session.
Right. But then before we dive into misinformation, general health misinformation, disinformation, what about the people who meet at their local ocean pool and they do it at 7 o'clock every morning and they jump in, they have a social thing, they swim a few laps and they get out again? What about them?
Yeah, I think if that's something that they have done for a long period of time, they really enjoy it, and it's not necessarily coming immediately after an exercise bout. I think it would be completely fine, especially if it's something that they've done quite a bit, and they aren't sort of experiencing any of those symptoms of cold shock. That would be fine, and I think that's probably another important thing is just sort of monitoring your responses to cold exposure. Like, yes, we're likely to experience, a little bit of sort of numbness at sometimes, and we're expected to feel cold. And when we first enter the water, we're probably going to breathe a little bit quicker. Our heart rate's going to increase. But if we're feeling nauseous, we're feeling dizzy, we're starting to feel tingling sensations, then that's probably a sign that we might want to get out as quick as we can.
Now, look, I've had something funny happen to me. Maybe you can help me. So I've done this occasionally. And so I'm walking down the middle of the window into the pool, towards the pool, and I'm just wearing my swimming costumes and a towel and a t-shirt. And I'm thinking, Jesus, cold, God, it's cold as God, it's cold as God, it's cold. I jump in the water against my better judgment, swim a minimum number of laps, and I come out and then wearing only my swimming cossies with my body wet and the wind blowing on me, I don't feel so cold anymore. What's going on there?
Yeah, I think that's just us really simply just getting used to the cold water. Like anything, we get used to those sort of sensations. It's the same as if you jump in a really hot bath, it feels really hot, and then you get used to it and it gets quite comfortable. I think that's more a sensory response where we're just sort of getting comfortable with that sensation, getting used to that sensation. And we've probably, cold shock generally lasts for sort of 1 to 3 minutes. And then we start to see that response come down. So it's probably we've also exceeded that sort of threshold there as well.
Look, I had one weird thing happen to me where I did a fair few laps on a cold day, and I came back and I was heading into the house to have a shower, and my daughter very kindly gave me a coffee to have in a shower and some chocolate, which is a crystalline state number 5 form of theobromine, which I knew from past experience. I do like chocolate. If I put the chocolate on my tongue and left it there, it would melt. So I put the coffee down, had a little sip, and then hopped in the shower, grabbed the chocolate, put it on my tongue, and it didn't melt. Does that mean my overall body temperature had dropped by half or 1 degree C?
Potentially. When we overheat, we tend to increase blood flow to the skin to promote sweating and stuff.
Ah,
In cold environments, we're likely to see a reduction in that. So it could just be that we've got less blood sort of running through those sort of superficial areas, including the tongue, and that could have caused a reduction in temperature. That's pretty speculative, but that seems plausible to me.
okay. Look, thank you so much for taking that on without notice. Now, okay, so tell me about misinformation, disinformation, and have I got it right? I'm not sure. Help me on this. I thought that disinformation, I could be wrong, is where people deliberately tell lies, and misinformation is when you, an innocent bystander, happen to hear that information. Oh my God, the moon is going to crash into the earth tomorrow. And then you pass it on to another person. Hey, Dr. Hunter, the moon's going to crash into the earth tomorrow. And you didn't make it up, but you passed it on. Is that the difference between disinformation and misinformation, or have I got that totally wrong?
No, that's spot on. The way that I sort of think about it is disinformation is information that's like false information that someone's giving deliberately. Um, and then misinformation is someone who's giving false information, but they believe it's true. So that's kind of the way that I distinguish it, which is just another way of saying what you just said.
Okay, so D for deliberate, D for disinformation, so it's a deliberate lie. Okay, so on TikTok, which is just a reflection of our society, I've read studies which show that 98% of all the medical health and nutrition advice is lies. And to their credit, TikTok have started up a hashtag STEM program where if you see that hashtag, it means it's been checked by fact checkers, so they're trying to do something right. So tell us where you stand on this misinformation, disinformation. Lay it on us, man.
So obviously there's a lot of it in the health and fitness space. And some of it is not particularly harmful. So, some of it is might be talking about specific types of exercise or specific dietary patterns that all in all aren't going to have negative health effects if someone were to adopt them. But then certainly there's others that could have really harmful effects. Things like I think I mentioned it earlier, the carnivore diet being a sort of eating pattern that's becoming increasingly prevalent amongst the health and fitness space, and it's really health negative. It has some really sort of health negative messaging attached to it, or messaging that could have a health negative effect, and that could have really long term negative effects on someone's health. So I think in some instances it can be quite dangerous and quite scary.
But on TikTok, I've seen pictures and on other places, I've seen people with incredible upper body musculature saying that they not only eat meat all the time, they eat nothing but meat. In fact, they'll eat it raw.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
I
Yep.
I think I read that one of them later got busted for taking huge amounts of steroids to build up that upper body part.
Yeah, yeah. So that was actually going to be my first comment. I think you always have to be a little bit cautious, or when you're sort of interpreting that information. I think just because you see someone who's doing something and they look the way that you want to look, it doesn't mean that thing is what made them look that way. In fact, in things like Instagram, TikTok, where people with really good physiques are sort of, they come up really common on the reels. They're really popular. They sort of are brought to the forefront because of the way they look. Whether those people are sort of on exogenous steroids and hormones and whatever else or not, they very well could be, but it could just be that what they did to get them looking like that is not what they're now selling you, essentially.
Okay, tell us another thing about misinformation, disinformation in health, nutrition, and exercise. Like, I remember getting attacked on TikTok for saying that chlorophyll wouldn't, if you just drank, mushed up grass, it wouldn't improve your health and cure cancer. So tell us some more stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So I think probably like one that's quite common is sort of sugar and carbohydrates being the cause of obesity. So I think that's a really common one that you see quite a bit. And I think that sort of messaging is it's probably not that harmful in the sense that like yeah, if you reduce carbohydrate intake and sugar intake, maybe you'll see a reduction in calories that could result in weight loss and could improve health. But the negative association with that is that people can become really fearful of eating certain foods. They can become fearful of going out into social situations where they have to try and avoid eating certain foods, and their life can become quite restrictive. And they also fall into this sort of mindset that this one thing is the only way that I'm going to improve health and lose weight and those sorts of things. When in fact you can eat a variety of different sort of food patterns and dietary patterns and still have positive health outcomes.
Well, I think there's a bit of misinformation, disinformation in that one of my circle of acquaintances said, "Oh, I've given up on carbs. All I eat now is vegetables." Aren't vegetables close to 100% carbs, Dr. Hunter?
Yeah, pretty much. You'll have some that are slightly less, like a green vegetable is a little bit less carb heavy, but carrots, potatoes, pumpkin, they're pretty much 100% carbs.
Okay, now give us another misinformation, disinformation that you've run across in the health exercise anywhere.
Yeah, so supplements is certainly another one.
Ah,
There is good evidence to suggest that something like creatine can have a positive effect on things like muscle growth and muscle strength. Things like caffeine can cause small improvements in performance. But beyond that, most supplements don't have a huge amount of research to support their use, but you'll still see them being touted as the next best thing. So, you might see people selling ketones or green tea extract or green coffee extract or carnitine is another one that does the rounds occasionally. And by and large, if they have any effect at all, it is trivial to none. So yeah, they're generally proposed to have these massive effects, but they just simply don't really.
ah. So, but I have heard things about creatine that it can sometimes help to a minor degree in certain specialized cases.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. So creatine is probably the most well researched supplement that we have in exercise science and sport science in
Ah,
that sort of area.
yep.
So if you take creatine every day, you're likely to, and you train regularly, you're likely to see slightly larger, like very small, but slightly larger improvements in things like muscle strength and muscle size than if you didn't take it. There is some inklings of research that suggest that it might also have cognitive benefits, but you probably need to take more of it than what you would for sort of the muscle building effects. But beyond that, that's kind of where the strongest research lies. There's a little bit of evidence to suggest that it might help with bone health, but that's less certain. So yeah, it's kind of like strength and hypertrophy. We're confident it has a very positive effect, but that effect is quite small. In other areas, we're sort of a little bit less certain.
Okay, so one of the things I learned in pharmacology was, and this goes back half a thousand years, all drugs are poisons, comma, what matters is the dose. So what are the side effects of creatine if you have too much?
There's actually really minimal side effects. You can get a little bit of bloating. Creatine is a molecule that's stored with water. So if you consume a lot of creatine, you can sort of see very short term increases in weight. And they'll stay for as long as you stay using creatine, but those increases are essentially just water weight. Some people also get a bit of gastrointestinal discomfort. So you often hear people recommend that you should take 20 grams a day for 7 days, which is a what they call a starting dose or a saturation dose, and then go on like 5 grams per day as a maintenance dose after that. And people often experience sort of well, not often, but people do experience gastrointestinal distress during that first sort of loading phase of 20 grams per day, which is not necessary. Just for those of you listening, you can just take 5 grams per day forever. And some people might just see like an increase in their frequency of urination, but beyond that, it's fairly safe. Doesn't seem to have any other side effects. It's that's I think that's why it has been so widely adopted in the health and fitness space because there is a little bit of research to support it. It's quite cheap, and there doesn't seem to be too many negative effects. But it's probably just not as effective as what some people say it is.
And you said the magic number is 5. If you're 5 grams or under per day, you're pretty safe with regard to side effects.
Yeah, yeah, you could go above 5 grams per day, but there's probably no need to. So the way creatine works is we have creatine phosphate in our muscles, and we use it for energy, but those stores are rarely full. And by taking 5 grams of creatine per day, you essentially just ensure that those sort of fuel reserves of creatine are full. And then that helps you sort of produce energy during exercise and things like that. Like most people consume creatine through their diet, so you get quite a bit if you eat red meat, and any other meat really. So you might actually only need to supplement 2 or 3 grams to fully saturate your cells with creatine. But maybe someone who's vegan might need to have all of that 5 grams. But that would be sort of a better safe than sorry dose that's not going to have any negative effect.
Wow, from what you're saying, I can sense that there's this vast undercurrent of knowledge that you're not able to spread with us in the short time that we have. So, as we come to the end now, how can people follow you in your fine work? So, I first came across you in the conversation with that wonderful article. And how can people follow you in your fine work? And in fact, if they want to become a PhD student with you or under you at the University of South Australia?
Yeah, so not particularly active on social media platforms. I do have a Twitter and Blue or X, sorry, and Blue Sky account that I use occasionally. But if you're interested in sort of following research updates, if you just Google Hunter Bennett ResearchGate, my ResearchGate will come up, and all my sort of research articles are available there. And then if you are interested in reaching out and having a conversation more directly, if you just Google my name and the University of South Australia, which I should note as well is actually going to be, as of next year, Adelaide University. We're merging with
What?
another. Yeah, we're merging with the University of Adelaide here. So the two largest South Australian universities are merging to make a very big university. So yeah, you might have to Google Hunter Bennett Uni SA Adelaide University, but I'll come up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunter. And look, thank you for writing that lovely article in the conversation, which led me to talking to you.
No, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Shirtloads of Science is washed, spun, and aired by the University of Sydney.